The first time Elias looked at me, he looked away so fast I thought I'd imagined it. That's how it always was with him, a glance stolen and hidden before I could even register it had happened. For 8 months, he never said a single word to me. Not hello. Not good morning. Nothing. And then one night, long after his husband had packed 2 suitcases and walked out of both their marriage and my life, Elias knocked on my door at almost midnight, his hands shaking, his eyes red, and said the only 4 words he'd ever said to me directly: "I need to talk." I didn't know it then, standing barefoot on the cold tile with my heart slamming against my ribs. But that knock would change everything I thought I understood about silence, about longing, and about the kind of love that waits so long it nearly forgets how to speak. My name is Daniel, and I was 24 when I moved into the 3rd floor of a narrow brick building on a quiet street lined with maple trees that turned gold too early every autumn. I'd just finished my degree in illustration, my savings were thin, and the apartment was cheap only because it came with an odd condition. My landlord and his husband lived on the floor above me, and the landlord, a man named Marcus, liked to personally interview every tenant before signing a lease. Marcus was warm in the particular way that older men who've lived through enough disappointment to soften instead of harden tend to be warm. He had a laugh that filled the room, silver threading through his dark hair, and an easy way of asking questions that made you feel like the only interesting person in the city. I liked him instantly. We signed the lease over coffee at his kitchen table, and within a week he was leaving me containers of leftover biryani on my doorstep because you're too skinny for a man who draws for a living. It took me nearly 3 weeks to learn that Marcus was married. He mentioned it casually, the way people mention weather. My husband doesn't really do mornings, and I remember blinking at him, recalibrating something in my head. I'd assumed, without meaning to, that he lived alone. I hadn't seen anyone else in the building except for a shadow behind frosted glass on the stairwell, someone who moved fast and never lingered long enough to become a face. That shadow had a name: Elias. I met him properly, or as properly as 2 people can meet without exchanging a single word, on a Tuesday evening in October. I was hauling a canvas up the stairs, wide enough that I had to turn it sideways to fit through the door, and I heard footsteps behind me on the landing. I turned, expecting Marcus, and instead found a man I didn't recognize standing 3 steps below me, watching. He was younger than Marcus, maybe close to my own age, with dark hair that fell messily over his forehead and eyes the color of wet slate, pale gray-green, unreadable, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He didn't smile. He didn't say excuse me or offer to help with the canvas that was clearly too big for the stairwell. He just looked at me for 2 long seconds, something unreadable moving behind his expression, and then stepped past me without a word, close enough that I caught the scent of cedar and rain on his jacket, and disappeared up the stairs. I stood there holding my canvas, feeling strangely winded, as if I'd just been asked a question I didn't know the answer to. "That's Elias," Marcus told me later that night, setting down 2 mugs of tea on my counter uninvited, the way he'd already started doing. "My husband. Don't take it personally. He's not much of a talker. Never has been, not even with me some days." I said something noncommittal, something about how not everyone needs to fill silence with words, and Marcus laughed and said I'd get along with Elias eventually, that he just needed time. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him that Elias's eyes had followed me for 2 full seconds longer than a stranger's ever should. For the next several months, that was the shape of my life, Marcus's warmth filling my evenings with easy conversation and shared meals, and Elias existing at the edges of it like a held breath. I'd see him at the mailboxes some mornings, and he'd nod, just barely, before retreating up the stairs 2 at a time. I'd catch him on the small shared balcony sometimes at dusk, a cigarette he never seemed to actually smoke burning down between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the street below, and if I stepped out to join him, he'd find a reason to leave within minutes. It should have felt like rejection. In a way, I suppose it was. But there was something about the quality of his silence that didn't feel like indifference. It felt deliberate, almost effortful, like a man holding a door shut against something that wanted very badly to get out. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself a lot of things that autumn. The first real crack in that silence came in November, during a storm that knocked out power across half the neighborhood. I was lighting candles in my kitchen, cursing my landlord's ancient wiring, when I heard a knock at my door, 3 short raps, hesitant, nothing like Marcus's easy double knock. I opened it to find Elias standing in the hallway, a flashlight in one hand, rain-damp despite having only walked down 1 flight of stairs. Behind him, the stairwell was pitch black. "Marcus is in Chicago for his sister's wedding," he said. His voice was low, rougher than I'd imagined it, like it hadn't been used in days. "I didn't want you to be alone up here without light." It was the first full sentence he'd ever spoken to me, and it landed somewhere in my chest I wasn't prepared for. I let him in. We sat on my living room floor by candlelight, and for the first 10 minutes neither of us said much of anything, just the small, careful sentences of 2 strangers testing whether conversation was safe ground. But something in the dark seemed to loosen him. He told me, unprompted, that he'd trained as an architect before an injury changed his plans, that he missed drawing buildings the way some people miss a person. When I showed him the sketch I'd been working on before the power died, a half-finished study of the maple tree outside my window, he studied it for a long, quiet moment, and then said, "You draw like someone who's used to being unseen. Everything soft. Nothing demanding attention." I didn't know how to respond to that. I still don't, if I'm honest, all these months later. It was the kind of observation that felt like being opened up and read from the inside, and it terrified me a little, how accurately a man who'd barely spoken to me could see something I hadn't said out loud to anyone. The power came back around midnight. Elias stood immediately, as if the returning light had broken some spell, and thanked me for the tea I'd made, and left so quickly the door barely clicked shut behind him. I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the candle flames guttering in the sudden electric brightness, feeling like I'd been handed something precious and fragile that I didn't yet understand how to hold. He didn't speak to me again for almost 3 weeks. Marcus, oblivious to whatever had shifted in that blackout, continued being Marcus, cheerful, generous, always finding reasons to knock on my door with food or gossip or an invitation to whatever event he decided I needed in my social calendar. I liked him. I want to be clear about that, because what happened later was never about me not caring for Marcus. He was kind to me in a season when I badly needed kindness, newly arrived in the city with no family nearby and a bank account that kept me up at night. But there were small things I started noticing, the way you notice a hairline crack in a wall only after someone points at it. Marcus and Elias were rarely in the same room together. When they were, their conversations had the clipped, functional quality of roommates dividing chores rather than husbands sharing a life. Marcus would talk about their early years, a trip to Lisbon, a fight over furniture, the wedding itself, with a wistfulness that made it sound like ancient history rather than a marriage still technically in progress. I wasn't looking for cracks. I promise I wasn't. But once you see one, you can't unsee it, and by December I'd started to understand, without either of them ever explaining it to me, that whatever love had once lived in that upstairs apartment had been quietly leaving for a long time before I ever arrived. Elias began speaking to me again in small, careful increments, as if testing whether the blackout had been an aberration or a door he could walk back through. A comment about the weather at the mailboxes. A recommendation for a bookstore when he saw me reading on the stoop. Once, seeing me struggle up the stairs with groceries, he simply reached out and took the heaviest bag from my hands without asking, carried it up 2 flights, set it on my counter, and left before I'd even finished saying thank you. Every one of these moments felt like a coin dropped carefully into a jar either of us acknowledged we were filling. By January, we had a routine we never named. Some nights, when I couldn't sleep, I climbed the narrow stairs to the building's flat roof, where someone long before either of us had left 2 mismatched folding chairs and a rusted little table. More often than not, Elias would already be there, or would arrive within 20 minutes of me, as if some shared insomnia had synced our internal clocks. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just sat under a sky too bright with city light to show many stars, passing a thermos of coffee between us, our knees inches apart, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him in the cold air. But when we did talk, it was different from any conversation I'd had with Marcus, slower, more careful, the kind of talk that comes from two people each afraid of saying too much and revealing something they weren't ready to name. He asked me once, out of nowhere, staring up at the hazy sky, whether I'd ever loved someone I knew I shouldn't. I remember the way my breath caught, the careful way I chose my next words, unsure if he was asking about himself or genuinely curious about me. Once I told him. It didn't end well. I don't think those kinds of feelings ever really do. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere past the rooftops. Sometimes, he said finally, not ending it is worse than ending it badly. I didn't ask what he meant. I think some part of me already knew, and I wasn't ready to hold that knowledge in my open hands yet, not while Marcus was still leaving containers of biryani on my doorstep downstairs, still calling me his favorite tenant, still, in whatever fading, complicated way, Elias's husband. That was the night, if I'm honest with myself, that I understood I was in trouble. Not because anything happened. Nothing happened. We sat 2 feet apart on a cold rooftop and said nothing more than half-confessions dressed up as hypotheticals. But something had shifted permanently in the air between us, some threshold crossed that neither of us could uncross, and I went back down to my apartment that night and lay awake until sunrise, furious with myself for wanting something I had no right to want. I want to tell you the truth about that winter, even the parts that don't make me look particularly good. There was an evening in February when Marcus invited a group of old university friends over, and I was included, the way I always seemed to be pulled into his orbit of warmth. Elias was there too, quieter than everyone else in the room, nursing a glass of wine he barely touched. At some point, one of Marcus's friends, a broad-shouldered man named Theo with an easy laugh, draped an arm over Elias's shoulders in some old joke I wasn't part of, and Elias smiled, actually smiled, in a way I'd never once seen him smile at me. I felt something ugly and unfamiliar twist in my chest, hot and immediate, and I hated myself for it. I had no claim on Elias. He was a married man, my landlord's husband, someone I'd shared maybe a dozen honest sentences with across 4 months of careful silence. And yet I sat on that couch nursing my own drink, watching another man's arm around his shoulders, feeling something that could only honestly be called jealousy, and understanding with a sinking clarity that I had let myself fall for someone I had no business falling for. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Marcus had fallen asleep on the couch mid-conversation the way he sometimes did, I found Elias on the rooftop, exactly where I somehow always knew he'd be. "You looked happy tonight," I said, and I hated how flat my voice sounded, how poorly I hid whatever ugly thing was still sitting in my chest. He glanced at me sideways, something almost amused flickering across his face. "Theo's an old friend. Nothing more. You don't owe me an explanation." "I know," he said quietly. "I gave you one anyway." We sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before, charged, deliberate, both of us aware that something had just been admitted without either of us saying the words out loud. I went to bed that night more confused than I'd ever been about anything in my life, caught between guilt over wanting a married man and a growing, terrifying certainty that he wanted me back. Guilt, once it takes root, doesn't ask permission before spreading. By March, I'd made a decision, a bad one, in hindsight, but it felt necessary at the time. I started avoiding the rooftop. I stopped answering Elias's rare texts about book recommendations with more than a polite word or two. When Marcus invited me to dinner, I found excuses, telling myself I needed distance from the whole tangled situation before I did something I couldn't undo. I told myself I was protecting a marriage. I told myself I was being a decent person. Some nights, staring at my ceiling, I almost believed it. Elias noticed, of course. How could he not? The distance I put between us was sudden and obvious, and I watched something close off behind his eyes whenever we passed each other at the mailboxes. That careful, guarded look he'd worn the very first day I met him, before the blackout, before the rooftop, before any of it. It was like watching a door swing shut that I myself had spent months slowly prying open, and the sight of it closing again hurt more than I was prepared for. "Did I do something?" he asked me once, catching me on the stairs, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, almost hesitant in a way that didn't suit him. "No," I said, too fast, too clearly a lie. "I've just been busy. Work." He studied me for a long moment, and I could see he didn't believe a word of it, but he didn't push. He simply nodded, said something polite about hoping the work went well, and continued up the stairs, and I stood there in the stairwell feeling like I'd just done something cruel to someone who had never once been cruel to me. The distance lasted almost 6 weeks. 6 weeks in which Marcus, still unaware of the current running beneath his own home, kept up his usual warmth toward me, and I kept accepting it with a guilt I couldn't fully explain even to myself. 6 weeks in which I told myself, over and over, that I'd made the right choice, that some feelings simply aren't meant to be acted on, that wanting something doesn't obligate you to reach for it. I almost believed myself. Almost. It was Marcus, in the end, who broke the silence none of us had been brave enough to name. He knocked on my door on a Sunday afternoon in April, no food in hand this time, no easy smile. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen on him before, the warmth in his face dimmed by something heavier. He asked if he could come in, and when I said yes, he sat at my kitchen table and was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "I'm not angry," he said finally, which was somehow the last thing I expected him to say, and also, in a strange way, exactly the thing I'd been dreading. "I want you to know that first, before anything else." My stomach dropped. "Marcus, Elias and I haven't been in love for a long time, Daniel." He said it plainly, without bitterness, like a fact he'd made peace with long before I ever moved into the building. "We got married young, when we thought that was what stability looked like. We've been living like roommates who share a bed for almost 3 years now. I think some part of me knew that before I even met you, and some part of me has known, since around November, that whatever Elias has been carrying, he's been carrying it for you." I didn't know what to say. I sat there, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, feeling something between relief and horror wash through me in waves. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," Marcus continued, and his voice, for the first time since I'd known him, wavered slightly. "I'm telling you because I'm tired of pretending I haven't noticed the way this apartment feels different when you and he are in the same room, and the way it's felt like a stranger's house for years before you ever moved in. We're filing for divorce. It's been a long time coming, and it has very little to do with you, even if you were the thing that finally made both of us admit it." He left not long after that, and I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, turning the conversation over and over, trying to understand how a man could speak about the end of his own marriage with such gentle, exhausted grace. 2 weeks later, Marcus moved out. I didn't see much of Elias in the days after Marcus left. The building felt strange, hollowed out somehow, as if the warmth Marcus had carried through its halls had left a permanent draft behind. I told myself to give Elias space to grieve a marriage, whatever its condition, space to sort through whatever he was feeling without me adding my own complicated wanting into the mix. Then, on a Thursday night close to midnight, 3 weeks after Marcus's things had disappeared from the apartment upstairs, I heard a knock at my door. 3 short raps. Hesitant. Exactly like the night of the storm. I opened it, and there he was, Elias, standing in the hallway in a wrinkled shirt, his dark hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it for hours, his gray-green eyes red-rimmed and raw in a way that made my chest ache before he'd said a single word. "I need to talk," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. I stepped back and let him in. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of my living room, arms crossed over his chest like he was holding himself together by force, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. "I've been sitting alone up there for 3 weeks, he finally said, "in an apartment that doesn't feel like mine anymore, thinking about the fact that the only person I've wanted to talk to since October has been avoiding me since March, and I don't know how much longer I can pretend that isn't the truth." My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. "Elias, I know I never talked to you," he said, cutting me off, the the words coming faster now, like something damned too long finally breaking free. I know that for the first months you knew me, I probably seemed cold, or rude, or like I didn't care that you'd moved in downstairs. The truth is I noticed you the very first day, carrying that ridiculous canvas up the stairs, and I panicked, because I was a married man and you were someone I had absolutely no business wanting to know better. So I stayed quiet. I told myself silence was the responsible thing. And then that storm happened, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore, and every month since has been this impossible math of trying to be a decent husband while feeling something for you that I had no right to feel. I stood there, frozen, watching this man who had spoken maybe 50 sentences to me across 7 months finally say everything at once, his voice unsteady, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. When you pulled away in March, he continued, quieter now, I understood. I did. I thought maybe you'd realized what a mess this whole situation was and decided to protect yourself from it. I don't blame you for that. But Marcus is gone now, and the marriage is over, has been over in every way that matters for a long time, and I've spent 3 weeks trying to decide whether it's fair to knock on your door and tell you any of this, or whether I should just let you go on with your life without this complication in it. And you decided to knock, I said softly. I decided I was tired of choosing silence, he said. Even if you tell me tonight that I misread everything, that whatever I thought I saw in you was never real, I needed to stop being the man who says nothing. I've been that man my whole life, and it's cost me things I can't get back. I crossed the room before I'd fully decided to. I don't remember the exact moment my feet started moving, only that suddenly I was standing close enough to him that I could see the fine tremor in his hands, close enough to feel the warmth of him the way I had on that rooftop months ago, except now there was no pretense of hypotheticals between us, no careful distance disguised as casual conversation. You didn't misread anything, I told him, my voice barely above a whisper. I've wanted to say something since that storm. I just didn't think I was allowed to. Something in his face broke open then, relief and disbelief and something achingly tender all at once, and he reached up, slowly, giving me every chance to step back if I wanted to, and brushed his thumb gently along my jaw. My breath caught. The room felt impossibly small and impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full, charged with 7 months of glances held too long and conversations cut too short. Daniel, he said, my name sounding different in his mouth than it ever had before, softer, like something he'd been holding on to and finally allowed himself to say out loud. Elias, I answered, and then there was no more space left between us at all. What happened next is not something I need to describe in detail. Some moments belong only to the people who lived them, and I think Elias would agree that the warmth of that night, the way it felt to finally stop pretending, to finally let 7 months of careful silence dissolve into something neither of us had to hide anymore, is ours to keep quietly between us. I will say only that it was gentle, and slow, and that somewhere in the middle of it I stopped being afraid of what I felt for the first time since October. People sometimes ask me, when I tell this story now, whether I feel guilty about how it began, about falling for a man while he was still, technically, someone else's husband. I've turned that question over more times than I can count, and the honest answer is this. Guilt lived in me for a long time, sharp and constant, right up until Marcus himself, months later, sat across from me at a coffee shop we'd chosen specifically because it wasn't the one near the apartment, and told me he was glad. Genuinely glad. That watching Elias finally open up to someone, finally choose honesty over silence, had taught him something about his own life he badly needed to learn. We were never going to make each other happy, Marcus told me, stirring sugar into coffee he wasn't drinking. We were just very good at not admitting that to ourselves. You didn't break anything, Daniel. You were just there when it finally broke on its own. Elias and I didn't rush things after that night. We took the months that followed slowly and carefully, the way you handle something you nearly lost before you'd even fully had it. We talked, really talked, for the first time without 7 months of careful restraint between us, about the injury that had ended his architecture career, about the loneliness that had defined so much of his adult life, about why silence had always felt safer to him than risking a truth that might not be wanted back. I moved out of the third floor eventually, not because anything went wrong, but because Elias and I found a small apartment across the city together, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of everything that had happened in that building. We still visit Marcus sometimes. He remarried 2 years later, a kind, quiet man named Julian who makes him laugh the way I remember him laughing that first week I moved in, and there's no bitterness left anywhere in any of it, just 3 people who found their way, eventually, to the lives they were actually meant to be living. Sometimes, late at night, Elias still doesn't say much. Some habits take years to fully unlearn. But now, when the silence stretches, he reaches for my hand instead of retreating into himself, and I've learned that his quiet was never coldness. It was just a man who'd spent his whole life believing he wasn't allowed to want things out loud. He knocked on my door on a Thursday night in April, and everything changed. I think about that a lot, how an entire life can turn on 3 soft raps against the door, how long 2 people can wait, and how much can be said in the end, once someone finally decides silence isn't worth the cost anymore. Should I tell you what happened the night Elias finally met my parents for the first time?